All right. It might be a good time to start. What do you think, Jennifer, Layel? Yeah? Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very glad to be here and to welcome you to this very last event of this academic year, the keynote of the Doing Gender lecture series of the Netherlands Research School of Gender Studies and Partners. My name is Ilse Lazarums. I'll be chairing the session today. And before I introduce our keynote speaker and our response to Jennifer's keynote, there's a few things that I would like to say. And the first is that this year our Doing Gender lecture series was dedicated to, in a way, spotlighting the work of alumni of the Graduate Gender program here at Utrecht University. And for those of you who've been there, it has really demonstrated the wealth and the scope of the work that's currently being done. And I want to thank my colleague Jamila Muscat, who is in the audience today, for the work that she did in putting this together. And also, on a related note, this lecture series and also the event today have been possible only due to the tireless work behind the scenes and behind the screens right now of Trude Oorschot and Florien Kelstra. So thank you very much to the both of you as well. Some practical remarks about today's session is that we have an hour and a half. We have until 5 p.m. Amsterdam time. And after my introduction, Jennifer will give a keynote of anywhere between 30 and 40 minutes, followed by Layel's response to that of about 10 minutes. The idea is that we have at least half an hour, if not more, for discussion. And now this format doesn't really allow for any visual question asking or hand raising, right? So my invitation to you would be to drop your questions into the Q&A whenever they come to you, and we'll look at them in the last part of the session. And the last thing I want to say is that today is July 1st, which is not only almost the beginning of summer, which is quite incredible when you think about it, after the difficult and surreal year that we've had. But it's also the day that here in the Netherlands and in Suriname, the day that commemorates and celebrates the abolition of slavery in Suriname and the Netherlands in 1863, the formal abolition. It took another 10 years for slavery to be abolished and for those enslaved to be freed. And it might not be that different. Perhaps we can think about it and talk about that about June 19th, right? Juneteenth, the way that that day was recently made a national holiday in the United States, the same way that there are very strong societal voices right now here to make July 1st a national holiday. So this is the context of today on which we are convening and conversing with each other. So having said all of these things, it is honestly my true joy to be able to welcome Jennifer C. Nash to our community of scholars and students and colleagues as our keynote speaker today. Jennifer and I, we were just talking briefly before we went live. We met a year and a half ago during that fateful year when the pandemic started, a few weeks before the pandemic started, when we were both spending a year at Harvard University, and I attended a talk that you gave there at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And you spoke about Black maternal health, Black maternal politics, the way that the lives of Black women and children and families are hugely impacted by the various inequalities that happen in the lives that you discussed. And I remember it being, in a way, a prelude to the book that will come out next month. And so I am thrilled that we have the prospect of new work coming out from you pretty soon. And for those of you who have not met Jennifer before, I'll give a slightly more formal resume of your work and your time. So Jennifer C. Nash is a professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University. She holds a PhD in African American Studies from Harvard and a JD from Harvard Law School. And Jennifer is the author of 2 award-winning books, and again, I imagine that will soon be 3. The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography from 2014, and Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality from 2019. And now soon in August, the book Birthing Black Mothers will be released from Duke University Press. And so it is my true joy to welcome you today and to spend some time with you here, listening and engaging with a talk that is called, slightly different from what was announced, called Intersectional Iconography, Promise, Peril, and Possibility. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for being here.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Well, I guess it's good morning here. It's good afternoon there. Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I wish I could be there with you in person, but I will hold out the hope for a future time when we can do that. So there's a long American tradition of academics changing the title of their talk moments before the talk. So I'm falling in line with that tradition. But what I wanted to do today is to share work that is relatively new and that I haven't shared before. About a year ago, the amazing Kathy Davis and Hamla Lutz invited me to be part of an edited volume that they're doing on intersectionality. And it allowed me the chance to sort of think through questions that remained unanswered for me from the book, Black Feminism Reimagined. So the material that I'm presenting today is in some ways what I sometimes call the B-sides or the outtakes from the book, the material that didn't make it into the book. And in some ways, it's a set of questions that I'm still trying to think through. So I'm particularly excited to hear how you all respond to this work in the Q&A. I also want to acknowledge from the outset, this is a very sort of visually oriented talk. I have lots of images and slides, and I'm very much aware of the kind of US-centeredness of the images that I'm going to show. And so I'm curious to hear from you how much of what I'm sort of describing and diagnosing about intersectionality visual travels resonates or doesn't resonate. So I'm going to talk for a second, and then I'm going to share my screen so you'll sort of see a slew of visual images. On a spring morning in 2018, I left an exercise class in a neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. My eye was drawn to a row of pink stickers that were decorating a lamppost in front of the studio. They said, "Expect intersectional resistance." A few days later, as I walked through another north side neighborhood, I passed someone carrying a tote bag that said, "My feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit." And let me share this so you can see it. Okay, so my feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit. This talk was born of the convergence of events that week and by a group of friends and colleagues who have helped me build an archive of images, products, signs, tote bags, mugs, all of which hail an understudied aspect of intersectionality, its status as a visual object. Over the course of the last decade, I have kept track of intersectionality's appearance in popular life. And since Donald Trump's election in 2016, I have been particularly attuned to intersectionality's visual iterations and attentive to how the term is as likely to appear on mugs and t-shirts, on tote bags and stickers, as it is to appear in scholarly articles. In many ways, this is what makes intersectionality distinctive. it has a public life that few, if any, other terms in feminist history have enjoyed. And much of this life is lived on clothes, mugs, stickers, keychains, pins, scarves, and hats. For some scholars, intersectionality's robust political life is evidence of its origins outside of the academy. Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilger, for example, insist that intersectionality began in activist circles and then moved into the university, where it became, in Collins's terms, a critical social theory. Their collective work underscores intersectionality's populist, public, and activist roots, and decenters the role of academic feminism in developing intersectionality's innovations. My scholarship on intersectionality has always aspired to disrupt narratives around intersectionality's origins, arguing that these narratives all too often find Black feminists claiming proprietary relationships to intersectionality, or reducing all Black feminist scholarly work to intersectionality. Thus, my turn toward intersectionality's public life is not born from a desire to narrate the term's roots. Instead, I trace how intersectionality has long had a life inside and outside the academy, and is often mobilized and inflected differently in these different spaces. It is a term that travels on and with academics like Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw, and on and with public intellectuals like Rachel Cargle, who's on the left, and Blair Imani, both of whom offer digitally curated materials on Black feminist theory generally, and intersectionality specifically. My work seeks to attend to the multiple iterations and voices intersectionality speaks in, and to capture how both Crenshaw's canonical article, Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Sex, and Rachel Cargill's The Great Unlearn digital coursework are crucial vehicles through which intersectionality comes into public view. And I should just drop a footnote and say, much of this has been made apparent to me through teaching over the last few years, where it is now almost always the case that my students, my undergraduate students, come to my class having already encountered the term intersectionality, even if they haven't read the texts that I think are canonical and sort of defining that term. And it is also the case that for many of them, their kind of early education about intersectionality has come through public feminisms in spaces like YouTube and Instagram and the like. My talk today suggests that it is time for serious engagement with intersectional iconography, and that this engagement should take the form of neither a romanticization of intersectionality's public work, nor the form of bemoaning the commodification and so-called appropriation of Black feminist innovations. Instead, I emphasize that intersectional iconography is crucial for scholarly investigation because intersectionality moves through the world visually. While scholars have studied how the term travels in the pages of scholarly journals, it also travels on tote bags filled at farmers markets with gym clothes, books, and toys, with lunches and groceries, and on t-shirts and signs that are carried at marches and placed in front of houses to announce a political worldview. As I argue in my book, Black Feminism Reimagined, the idea of travel has become central to how Black feminist scholars describe and agonize over intersectionality's at times disorienting movement into spaces, fields, and disciplines that feel unfamiliar or maybe even hostile. In this talk, I inflect the term travel differently, reading intersectionality's visual life as a crucial way of thinking through the term's travels. If the visual is how we so often encounter intersectionality, and if this term is increasingly, as I argue in my earlier work, tethered to both promise and pitfall, it is worth sustained analysis of how the visual contributes to intersectionality's representation as both a world-opening possibility and a world-ending threat. This talk is also an endeavor to think about how the visual logics of intersectionality, its status as metaphor, have come to shape the term's lives and afterlives, the way it is imagined and understood. In turning attention to the visual life of intersectionality, I emphasize that intersectionality has always been a visual endeavor. In some of my earlier work on the term intersectionality, I described the term as, quote, irresistibly visual. And I emphasized the importance of understanding intersectionality as a metaphor. In her canonical article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, Kimberly Crenshaw offered us two metaphors to explain intersectionality. Both were committed to allowing readers to visualize intersectional harm and to imagine intersectional justice. And I show these two images only because I think there was a moment, at least when I think of my own sort of history of teaching in feminist theory, when I would teach intersectionality and my students would often understand it or visualize it or diagram it as these kind of crossroads. And then they would sort of offer increasingly complicated landscapes of road work to think about multiple structures coming together. So in the first metaphor that Crenshaw offers, she analogizes Black women's experiences of discrimination to traffic flowing through an intersection. She writes, and I quote, "Consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction, and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them." Crenshaw's first analogy insisted on the importance of recognizing Black women's embodied presence in the intersection and how Black women navigate forms of violence that are multidirectional. While this analogy has traveled far and wide, with intersectionality often visually represented as a crossroads, Crenshaw's article also offered a second visual analogy to describe Black women's locations vis-a-vis anti-discrimination law. This second analogy, which Anna Karastasis argues requires critical attention, finds Crenshaw offering a pointed critique of the logic of anti-discrimination law. Crenshaw writes, and this is a lengthier quote, but I think it bears reading. "Imagine a basement which contains all people who are disadvantaged on the basis of race, sex, class, sexual preference, age, and/or physical ability. These people are stacked, feet standing on shoulders, with those on the bottom being disadvantaged by the full array of factors, up to the very top, where the heads of all of those disadvantaged by a singular factor brush up against the ceiling. In efforts to correct some aspects of domination, those above the ceiling admit from the basement only those who can say that but for the ceiling, they too would be in the upper room. Yet this hatch is generally available only to those who, due to the singularity of their burden and their otherwise privileged position relative to those below, are in the position to crawl through." Part of what is striking about this analogy is Crenshaw's commitment to thinking about the corporeality of violence, her representation of Black women's bodies as literally supporting the weight of those who stand on their shoulders. Here, Crenshaw is quite attentive to how discrimination takes a toll on Black women's flesh. And her analogy is also committed to revealing the flaws of US anti-discrimination law, which requires articulating harm as either race-based or gender-based, remedying the violence that only the most privileged marginalized people experience, and leaving vulnerable the most marginalized. This in many ways is the heart of Crenshaw's critical project, revealing how a legal regime ostensibly designed to protect the most marginalized actually leaves them violently exposed, distinctly vulnerable to forms of harm that law will simply ignore. Crenshaw is not alone in her spatial conceptualization of Black women's locations and identities, her insistence on the visual as a crucial register for examining and describing Black women's embodied experiences. Anne Ducille, naming her ambivalence around the institutionalization of Black feminist studies, describes what she calls, quote, "the traffic jam that Black feminist studies has become." Like Crenshaw, Ducil describes the threat of the intersection by noting, quote, one of the dangers of standing at an intersection, particularly at such a suddenly busy three-way intersection, is the likelihood of being run over by oncoming traffic. What Ducil and Crenshaw share is their commitment to offering a visual lexicon for imagining Black women's particular and distinct experiences of harm. It is worth wrestling with how this early visual vocabulary shaped how intersectionality continues to rapidly circulate as something that is visualized and imagined as much as it is discussed and debated. In fact, intersectionality, I argue, was meant to be seen, to be imagined. So in my talk today, I briefly travel with three iterations of the visual life of intersectionality: the product, and in particular, I'm going to think about the tote bag; the movement sign, which has become its own product, particularly after the women's marches in the US and globally; and the meme, where intersectionality appears, particularly in spaces like Twitter. In my readings of all three objects, I resist the impulse to bemoan how intersectionality appears and travels through the world on objects. And instead, I aspire to sit with these objects to grapple with how each narrates intersectionality in a visual register, offering its viewers and perhaps its wearers ways of understanding intersectionality's power and perhaps its shortcomings as well. But before I turn to that, I want to, in the written version of this, I have a section called Caveat, Thoughts on Political Bona Fides and the quote unquote problem of white women. So in some ways, this is my lengthy caveat. This talk largely sidesteps the question of intersectionality as a left political bona fide, one that can be made visible by wearing the right t-shirt, by carrying an intersectionality tote bag, or drinking from an intersectionality mug. Though I do take up this question in some of my other scholarly work, particularly a co-authored piece that just came out in Signs that I wrote with Samantha Pinto. It is certainly the case that some of intersectionality's elevation to body art, to political slogan, adorning t-shirts and posters, has to do with various actors mobilizing the term to claim a solidarity with Black women, who are increasingly described as the conscience of the US left, as the only political subjects who vote in ways that support collective life, who offer the only sustainable vision of humanity, and who are imagined to be fleshy embodiments of intersectionality. Even as I flag the US left's hailing of Black women as the nation's political conscience, made visible in some of the slogans you see here, like Thank Black Women and Let Black Women Lead, I want to make clear that it is certainly not the case that power has been ceded to Black women. Instead, the US left performs its romance with Black women by repeatedly reminding us that everything we know or have come to know, Black women already knew. The manifestations of this romance can take myriad forms, ranging from the widespread celebration of Stacey Abrams after President Biden's election, to the call to quote unquote thank Black women after an Alabama special election in 2017, where 98% of Black women voters supported Democrat Doug Jones. Tom Perez, the chair of the Democratic National Convention, took to Twitter in that moment to remark, quote, Black women led us to victory. Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and we can't take that for granted, period. Perez's celebration of Black women voters echoed Brittany Cooper's statement, where she said, quote, I believe Black women are the saviors of this country. In much of my earlier work, I interrogate the left's rhetorical romance with Black women, examining both why it is deeply seductive to Black women and Black feminists. And there I argue that in short, it feels better to be treated as morally correct than pathological and contributing to the downfall of the state. And I also explore why this kind of romance around Black women is still part of treating Black women not as complex subjects, but as symbols. This romantic engagement with Black women also has the effect of treating Black women's intellectual production, including intersectionality, as a site of moral certitude, rather than as a long, generative, and complex history of debate, disagreement, and dissent. The move to intersectionality as wearable art, as a shield that covers the body, can be understood, at least in part, as a way of proclaiming one's affiliation with Black women in this moment, and particularly in the context of the US, as a way of making visible one's disavowal of white feminism, which is a term that I always use in quotes. As Samantha Pinto and I argue in our analysis of the contemporary construction of white feminism in the US, white women have come to be feminism's bad, or perhaps even worst, object. White feminism now circulates, oftentimes synonymously with white women, to represent the most problematic form of feminism, even as it is often questionable how it relates to feminism, and to describe the most problematic feminist actors. White feminism has come into particular view in the period following Trump's presidential election in 2016, the same period when intersectionality was increasingly and visibly hailed as feminism's future. In the weeks following Trump's election, as some Americans engaged in soul searching to explain the election's outcome, the mainstream media repeatedly reported that it was white women who had been instrumental in securing Trump's victory. And in the months that followed, a growing chorus of journalists and scholars interrogated how and why it is white women, often called Karens, sometimes called Beckys, who are agents of anti-Black violence. Whether in the case of Amy Cooper on the left in Central Park, who famously/infamously called the police to report a threatening a Black man she had encountered in the park. Lisa Alexander, the San Francisco white woman who called the police after seeing a man of color stenciling BLM on his own property, or Jennifer Schulte on the right, deemed BBQ Becky by the internet, who called the police on Black people having a barbecue in Oakland. Images of white women in Make America Great Again hats cheering for Trump, media coverage of white women violently policing Black people and enlisting the state to surveil Black people, and descriptions of white women weaponizing tears to their own ends cemented the idea that white women are feminism's problem. In a moment when intersectionality is hailed as feminism's future, precisely what liberates us from the imagined exclusivity of feminism's past and present, white feminism is hailed as its opposite, anachronistically and violently attached to the state, to carcerality, and perhaps even to the idea of gender as shared and singular. To insist that one's feminism is intersectional is to spotlight the violence of white supremacy masquerading as feminism. It is to orient oneself towards Black women rather than white women, and to invest in the narrative, or I would say the fiction, that these are two diametrically opposed identities and political positions. And to make this insistence visible, to wear this insistence, is a way of publicly claiming a kind of political virtue. I offer this brief rehearsal of the contemporary US feminist landscape to acknowledge that some of the move toward wearable intersectionality is a way of marking bodies, particularly white bodies, as emphatically not Karen, not Becky, as aligned with Black women. The shirt, the mug, the tote bag, then, can be mobilized as evidence of a performance of feminism that refuses whiteness. My analysis in the rest of this talk aspires to be mindful that wearing intersectionality can be a performance of what we might call an anti-Karen politics, but I also aspire to sit with intersectionality's other visual projects, meanings, and endeavors. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about tote bags. Okay, so the Society 6 website features a designer, Rachel Frankel, selling a brightly colored intersectional tote bag, which you see here on your screen. Society 6 bills itself as, in its words, a thriving community of independent artists worldwide, each with their own unique design. And Frankel's tote bag is only one of the many intersectionality-inspired products the website sells. There are art prints that rehearse Audre Lorde's oft-quoted, "There is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not lead single-issue lives." There are signs that playfully proclaim, "Talk intersectional feminism to me," and a pillow that announces, that the revolution will be intersectional or it will not be revolution. And then there are tote bags. Intersectionality makes me horny, as you see here. A celebration of, quote, intersectional intergalactic feminism, and Rachel Frankel's colorful bag that says intersectional feminism or bust. And during the ongoing pandemic, the website also sold a matching intersectionality face mask. Frankel's page noted that the proceeds from her products are themselves politicized. She donates proceeds to Planned Parenthood and to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. I begin my investigation of intersectionality's visual logics with the tote bag because it is a crucial way that intersectionality moves through space. And it is as an object that makes the case for intersectionality's capacity to cover, envelop, encompass, and touch everything else. Thus, I read the tote bag not merely as an advertisement for intersectional politics or even belief, but also as a statement of intersectionality's capacity to encase other objects, tangible or abstract. Before I turn to the tote bag's capacity to encase other objects, it is important to note that it is not an uncomplicated object. Myriad tote bags and signs and mugs include the slogan that now travels apart from its author: "My feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit." Flavia Zodin titled an essay with this sentence, and it has become a slogan, a political sign, and a phrase that adorns products. In fact, the phrase is described by one US news source as, quote, helping proliferate the idea of intersectional feminism. Journalist Aja Romano reports, and I quote, thanks to the rise of one of her quotes as a catch-all mantra for feminism, Zodin has seen her own words turned into a cash machine, one that she is powerless to stop. Zodin has offered critical reflections on the fact that her phrase, her sentence, has become a product, one that not only travels apart from her name and recognition of her authorship, but also without any compensation for her intellectual or creative labor. She writes, and I quote, imagine for a second my face when I recently found out that there is a vast array of merchandise that bears those words and my name for sale on the internet. T-shirts, pins, tote bags, posters, mugs, cross-stitched frames. The most egregious of these items is this cutesy little pin with a blonde little girl picking flowers. Sometimes they don't even spell my name right. And here we go back to talking about the difficult things, because this merchandise exists within the context of my own life. In all the years I have been writing on the internet, I have made a grand total of a bit over 1,000 euros. That's right. In almost a decade of constant output, I've made, I'd say, an average of 140 euros per year. Zodin's reflections on watching her words travel to markets she never imagined in ways she could never anticipate, often detached from her name, raises enduring questions about the politics of citationality and Black feminist thought. What does it mean to have one's words traveled or taken apart from one's name? And what do we make of these questions about compensation and valuation? Questions that have come to be central to Black feminist thought, particularly as it is practiced in the US Academy, with calls to not only recognize Black women's labor and to stop saddling Black women with superfluous diversity work. The call for Black women to be fairly compensated has circulated with new velocity. It is worth thinking about both Zodin's claims that her work is taken without credit, alongside Rachel Frankel's donations of proceeds from her work, her tote bag, to the ACLU and Planned Parenthood. Together, these pleas call attention to the complex questions of profit, credit, and value that swirl around intersectionality when it moves through the world, not just as a visual object, but also as a commodity. We might also ask, when does credit and profit end? If Zodin, for example, offers a pithy sentence celebrating intersectionality, should Crenshaw or Collins or the Combahee River Collective also profit? And what forms might that profiting take, given the Black feminist tradition's long-standing critique of conventional and hegemonic conceptions of value? I mention this here in the context of the tote bag to mark my refusal to consider the tote bag as a politically innocent object, and to complicate calls to celebrate, cite, or appreciate as ways of getting us out of the challenges the moment that we are in brings. Instead, I sit with the tote bag and ask what it signals and signifies as it moves through the world. My own experience with the intersectionality tote bag, both Frankel's and others that I have spotted at farmers markets, bakeries, cafes, and gyms, is that there is a class politics to these bags, and even in the US, to the reusable cloth tote bag in general, ongoing debates about plastic bag taxes, and the race and class politics of the modern environmental justice movement have to be gestured to here. This tote bag moves objects through the world, and in so doing suggests that intersectionality might have that capacity, that it might be able to encompass different kinds of objects, whether the literal objects lugged in tote bags themselves, or in the form of multiple political ideologies and beliefs. In this vision, it is not merely that intersectionality is itself mobile, it is that intersectionality can hold other objects. Here, intersectionality in its canvas iterations is a sign of its capaciousness. It can be spread open to carry more. This is a vision of the analytic's radical possibility, its capacity to be expansive, capacious, to open feminist politics up to forms of world-making and freedom dreaming that it had not envisioned possible yet. I want to say a bit about another kind of visual object, which is movement signs. Movement signs have become a genre. And here's some others. In the wake of the women's marches after Trump's election in 2016, images from marches, particularly images of signs designed by marchers, circulated. Most famously, oh, there's another one. Here's the most famously one. Okay, most famously, Angela Peoples' sign that said, "Don't forget, white women voted for Trump," went viral. The carefully composed image that rapidly circulated on social media featured Peoples holding her sign. Behind her were 3 white women wearing so-called pussy hats, each seemingly absorbed by capturing the energy of the march on their phones. The journalist Aaliyah E. Dastiger described this image as, quote, "a big deal," and wrote, quote, "To many, the now viral image of a sober-looking Angela Peoples and the blithe faces of the white women behind her epitomize a divide between white women and Black women that was unmistakable in the 2016 election. In December 2017, 11 months after this photograph was taken, Angela Peoples published an editorial in the New York Times about this image. She wrote, "My message stood in stark contrast to the themes of togetherness that dominated the Women's March, the pink quote unquote pussy hats and girl power placards, and chants about how women would lead the resistance. This was exactly the point. I made the sign to communicate that in a world where 53% of white women voters choose a racist, elitist, sexual predator for president, the idea that we all want the same thing is a myth. I wanted to highlight that on a national level, white women are not unified in opposition to Trumpism and cannot be counted on to fight it." Though People's sign never mentioned intersectionality, it was often taken as a visible symbol of the women's march's pitfalls and promise. Her sign epitomized the critical political challenges that intersectionality raises, and the challenges, and perhaps even threat, it was thought to pose to feminism itself. The march or marches were imagined to provide unity, a public display of outrage in the face of Trump's election. But in the weeks and months following the marches, there was endless debate as to whether the march had been adequately, quote unquote, intersectional, if the pussy hat, the icon of the march, was transphobic, and whether a singular march in response to multiple forms of violence was possible. People's sign and the image that captured it was a perfect icon for the moment that intersectionality found itself in, suddenly on its biggest and most public stage. Intersectionality, imagined to be embodied by Black women, was the opposite of white feminism, embodied by white women. Depending on how you interpret this image, and perhaps depending on your politics, People's sign is either a call for a form of intersectional feminism that undoes the violence of white supremacy, or an unwelcome interruption in a moment that promised feminist unity against misogyny. Since the Women's March movement signs have been collected and published in art books, perhaps most famously the book Why We March, and these books work in part to make visible feminism's continued relevance and vibrancy, its urgency in the face of the Trump presidency. These collections often include myriad images of signs that champion feminism's multiplicity and the particular capacity of intersectional feminism to respond to the conditions of the present. But how might we understand the market for these signs and the market for coffee table books that celebrate these signs? And how do they represent intersectionality in a moment where it's possibility and peril? Here, the movement sign becomes an indication that intersectionality has not ruined feminism, but enhanced it, that it can be incorporated into the body of the movement, and perhaps even stand for feminism itself. The movement sign that hails intersectionality's urgency becomes evidence of the capaciousness of feminism. But there is another story, of course, one about the politics of impossibility that has often haunted intersectionality. People's image could be taken as evidence of a story that has long tracked Black feminist theory, and perhaps even Black women, that it is difficult. What happens if even the election of a violent misogynist cannot unite feminists together under the mantle of feminism? Intersectionality's real or imagined demand for a left project that could think Islamophobia, transphobia, carcerality, misogyny, and anti-Blackness simultaneously, that refused the icon of the pussy hat, offered a vision, utopic or apocalyptic, of a left movement that centers the multiply marginalized and that thinks across multiple forms of violence and their intersections. This was a political vision that many found to be impossible, and I think many still do find it impossible. And the movement sign, with its call for an intersectional feminism that is not bullshit, can be interpreted as representing a desire for an impossible object, a feminism that could never be simply because it is asked to hold so much. Here we might think of a contrast with the tote bag, which I interpreted as perhaps revealing that intersectionality can hold it all. The movement sign shows that intersectionality's imagined call for holding multiple political desires can lead to collapse, or at least fatigue. Perhaps the market for the signs that offer the fiction of a coherent feminist politics exist and proliferate precisely because they provide a fantasy, one that intersectionality relentlessly punctures with its refusal of cohesion, its insistence on a left, provisional, messy, and fraught coalitional politics. The last set of images that I want to share is a section of the paper that I call "This Theory is Not a Sofa." It appeared on Twitter, and it still does from time to time, the Intersectional Sofa. This is not a sectional sofa, but an intersectional one. Sometimes it appears as a confession that one's own sofa is intersectional, and sometimes it appears as a wish for one. What do we make from this meme, aside from its humorous play on the sonic similarity between sectional and intersectional? What does it mean when intersectionality becomes a meme, something that circulates in digital space as a play on its travels, its familiarity, and the confusion around the term and its lives? Here, intersectionality travels not as a product or political commentary, but as a site of humor, perhaps even a gentle jab at how the term circulates in ways that often seem confused or conflated with other terms. I think, for example, of the number of times I have heard intersexual and intersectional confused. We might think there are here a number of other memes, which I'll slowly roll through so you can see them. Perhaps we might also think of these memes as capturing a set of political desires, where even the most mundane object, the living room sofa, can be a performance of one's politics. Make that sectional sofa intersectional to show just how woke you are. Anja Marie Hancock's work develops the idea of intersectionality as a meme. She notes, for the past 4 years, I've been traveling to conferences and publicly grappling with the idea of whether intersectionality can be the intellectual property of a single demographic group, or whether it is, in fact, a meme. Her notion of intersectionality as meme, which she distinguishes from intersectionality as intellectual property, frames my understanding of the intersectional sofa. Yet I read the idea of the intersectional meme as revealing something important about the comical as well. If intersectionality circulates with intense velocity, it circulates in surprising ways. It turns up in unexpected places and attaches to objects, affects, and performances that feel strange, particularly for those of us who are trained in or otherwise attached to Black feminist intellectual genealogies, which recognize intersectionality as a form of seeking justice for the multiply marginalized. The intersectional sofa, in its delightful absurdity, calls attention to intersectionality's myriad popular manifestations and appearances, revealing not that the term is inherently elastic, but that its usages are. It suggests that intersectionality has become an adjective that modifies so many things, perhaps anything. So we can think neither of the success or failure of the analytic in this regard, and instead only examine the distance the term has traveled, marking even political desires for furniture to articulate a worldview. The meme is repeated, it circulates, it moves on Twitter and Instagram, much as intersectionality itself is repeated, circulated, and in digital transit. And here the intersectional sofa meme comes to represent how intersectionality comes to appear and reappear. The endless rehearsal of this joke allows us to see intersectionality being made and remade in the visual register in real time, and requires us as viewers to ask ourselves, how does that feel for you? I want to conclude with a few remarks in a section that I call What's the Future? If wearable feminist products have become all the rage, so has one particular phrase. The future is. The future is female. The future is intersectional. The future is trans. The future is genderqueer. This term appears on all of the products I've mentioned, mugs, t-shirts, and the like, hailing a utopian vision of a different kind of future time, one marked by new forms of relationality, new kinds of politics, new visions of freedom. This refrain reminds us that the unbearable conditions of the present can be reimagined, remade, and challenged. And this refrain suggests that feminism, in its varied forms, is essential to imagining a livable future. The fact that this slogan appears so often on shirts, bags, mugs, and the like also emphasizes that we need to be able to visualize a future that we want, even if that vision is still unfolding and forming. In this talk, I ask what happens if we attend to intersectionality's visual iterations and treat the deeply public visual life of intersectionality not as adjacent to the term, as a misreading of the analytic or as a problem, but instead as central to how intersectionality's possibilities, perils, and pleasures are culturally represented and understood. When intersectionality appears at the grocery store on a tote bag, on a runner's chest in the form of a t-shirt, on a mug filled with coffee, or as a joke on Twitter, its meanings expand, morph, and shift. It is here that I think we find something truly powerful. Intersectionality is not yet certain. It will not ever be. And while its capacity to shift or be shifted can engender unhappiness, ambivalence, or as I argue elsewhere, defensiveness, it also suggests intersectionality's continued power as a tool of radical imagination. The visual seems to promise us certainty. It takes what is abstract and hard to grasp and renders it tangible and clear. And yet intersectionality's visual iterations show us something perhaps unsettling, that this term is not done, that it is ever changing and still constantly shifting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I loved how you emphasized the visual aspect, or as a sort of an entryway into our discussion of intersectionality. I'm imagining the rounds of applause that echo through our, our rooms and our virtual spaces right now. So thank you very much. Layal, I'm not sure if I gave you a proper introduction, but many of us watching know you. Layal Ftouni is an assistant professor also at the Graduate Gender Program, and you were very excited to give a response today to Jennifer. So the floor is yours. I will leave the two of you spotlit, right? So you could also be in conversation if wanted. So let's spend the next 10 minutes or so listening to Layal. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilsa, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Jennifer, for this thought-provoking lecture. I think a lot of the points that you've made in terms of thinking intersectionality through the lens of visuality come up a lot, or sort of are adjacent to some of the points that you have discussed in your book, Black Feminism Reimagined. But rather than emphasizing on the visual in the book, you look more at sort of the epistemological formation, the institutional circulation of intersectionality, and sort of the possibility of its intellectual and political reach. And so I, in my preparation for today's lecture, which originally was entitled a love letter from a critic on the intersectionality wars, I sort of went back to look at, to reread your book, and much of my sort of commentary more emerges from your arguments in the book and expands a little bit to think of some of the points you make in the context of the Netherlands and the intersectionality debates within the Dutch context. So as you've already done, you've sort of introduced a new angle to intersectionality. I will take us back a little bit to some of the arguments you lay out in your book and relate it somehow to the Dutch context, and hopefully allow that to maybe sort of give you a bit more of an insight as to some of the debates that emerge from the Netherlands. My response primarily covers 3 points. The first concerns Afropessimist takes on intersectionality. The second points to how intersectionality and its wars travels, and this is where I speak of the Dutch context. And third point concerns Palestine. The urgency and importance of your interventions in the intersectionality debates does not only have profound implications on the reimagining of Black feminism as a visionary world-making project within the academy, but also on feminist anti-racist coalitional work and politics within and outside of the university. As I was rereading your book, Black Feminism Reimagined, in preparation for this task, I was in awe of the generosity and generative potentiality of your thoughts. The book offers a daring commentary on intersectionality wars, and it insists on deterritorializing Black feminism's attachment to intersectionality as a labor of love and of letting go. In your scholarship, you designate intersectionality war in the US context as a descriptive term to outline the fraught tension over intersectionality's origin stories. And you sort of addressed that a little bit today as well, specifically looking at Black feminist defensiveness against what is perceived as intersectionality's appropriation and whitening in women's studies. You show how the defensiveness garners its political and affective charge from the corrective labor practiced by feminists to retell the history of intersectionality as one which is tethered to one singular origin. More importantly, you also show how the defense claim to intersectionality in Black feminism hinders its emancipatory potential. You neither pathologize such feeling nor ignore the violence of exclusions of Black feminist scholars from the realm of the university and the histories and experiences of anti-Blackness, misogyny, and racialized sexism. Rather, your call is a practice of what you call letting go as a way of opening up feminism to, and I quote, an expansive intellectual, political, ethical, and creative reach, one that you see as always, and I quote again, transcending attempts to limit the tradition by rooting it in embodied performances. The book sheds an important light on the ways in which critics of intersectionality have come to be vilified and demonized by intersectionality scholars and imagined as performing destructive gestures of the concept and analytic. Specifically, you show how, these vilifications become the more profound with the more recent charges of race traitorships in Intersectionality Wars along the axis of newly found separation between Black people of color versus non-Black people of color. These divisions, one can argue, are symptomatic of recent encounters between intersectionality and Afropessimism, a line of thinking advanced by Frank Wilderson and that Gloria Wekker has appropriately characterized as loveless and hopeless. I see the growing traction of the pessimistic political intellectualism emerging hand in hand with a more atomized identity-based approach to intersectionality. And you mentioned briefly here sort of the visual component of this atomized identity as embodied in the corporality of the Black woman. So I see that sort of emerging hand in hand with an atomized identity-based approach to intersectionality in both scholarly and activist discourse, not only in the US, but also here in the Netherlands. And I will sort of return to this point later. The Afro-pessimist spin on intersectionality can be best exemplified in the recent article, which you have suggested for our students to read today, by Sirma Bilge, entitled "The Fungibility of Intersectionality and Afro-Pessimist Reading," where Bilge precisely reproduces the defensiveness over intersectionality's origin stories that you have so carefully mapped. In this article, Bilge foregrounds Afro-pessimist perspectives on fungibility and natal alienation to theorize what she, and I quote, terms the removal of Black feminists from the theoretical innovations in intersectionality. I won't have time to discuss Bilge's article at length here, but I do want to point to one of her key claims that I want to problematize. Bilge argues that the practice of widening the scope of intersectionality requires the production of Black women and Black feminist intellectual labor as fungible commodities, akin to the status of the enslaved Black woman in her labor under slavery. In other words, slavery's afterlife is found in the fungibility of Black feminism's intersectionality, where women's labor can be extracted and erased and become the condition for the emergence of what she calls a disembodied universal intersectionality. And I think today your reference to Flavia Zodan's sort of commentary around her statement being extracted, erased, and her labor not recognized, this notion of accreditation and extraction also has come up in your talk. What I find most concerning, but also intriguing in this account, is not that all along Bilge seems to have an imagined origin story of intersectionality that demands recognition, or else we're all complicit in anti-Black violence, but the article also selectively misreads the central ethos of your loving critique of intersectionality. Rather than seeing your critique of intersectionality wars as a love letter that refuses the impasse of intersectionality's exclusive territoriality to the figure of the Black woman, rather than seeing that as an act of what you call a radical openness and embrace of intimacy with and amongst all women of color, Bilge sees your work as amplifying rifts between Black feminists and non-Black feminists. And I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts on the Afro-pessimist takes on intersectionality. What would, to use your words, a love letter from a critic to the Afro-pessimist spin on intersectionality look like? Is it even possible to perform this mode of address to a discourse that is structured around a racial impasse, that foregrounds homogeneous notions of Blackness as the ultimate experience of dispossession and of Black women labor within the academia as fungible? And who gets to initiate the letter? Now, of course, the contestations over the travels of intersectionality across disciplines, fields of studies, and geopolitical contexts, and the proprietarian responses and origin stories they evoke is not something that is specific to the US. Neither are the vilifications of intersectionality's critics and appropriators. Critique of intersectionality's appropriation and its commodification of who gets to speak for Black feminism and Black feminist scholarship travel too. In other words, not only have US-centered debates on intersectionality traveled, intersectionality wars have too. And this has been the case in the Dutch context. And this takes me to my second point. In the article I'm co-writing with Miriam Aurag, Shruti Bala, and Micah Botman for the Routledge Companion to Intersectionality, the volume that you're co-editing with Samantha Pinto, we expose the generational divide over intersectionality's political praxis, aspirations, and analytical claims. We show that intersectionality's current political and theoretical articulations and contestations in academic and activist spaces in the Netherlands largely leans on dominant narrative in and around US-based intersectionality debates. This partly has to do with the fact that, unlike the US, Black feminism has yet to be institutionalized as a field of study, despite relentless efforts by Black Dutch feminists over the last 3 decades. And partly due to the fact that the recent ubiquitous circulation of intersectionality across academic programs as a corrective analytic to the race and gender program, or as a gesture of inclusivity and diversity. Both intersectionality as corrective and intersectionality as diversity work function, and this is something you also map out in your book, as temporary modes of institutional redress. To use Sarah Ahmed, for closing the gap. That is here by adding curricular readings, especially US Black feminist scholarship, in hiring decisions or funding student diversity project. But against this backdrop of such neoliberal remedies to institutional racism, some scholars often ended up collapsing their critique of intersectionality's institutional appropriation with a critique of who gets to speak the language of intersectionality and who gets to advance research on it. The latter, in many instances, one of which has been mentioned in Bilge's article, this was clear, in many instances, one mentioned in Bilge's articles, where authors were questioned on their entitlement to speak about intersectionality on the basis of their non-Black POC or white passing status. The problem with these mechanisms of weighing down on who gets to close the gap is that they reproduce precisely the neoliberal mechanism they seek to dismantle. And they also sort of reproduce what you were talking about, the fact that intersectionality becomes here embodied within the corporality of a specific body, race and gendered body. So in the chapter, we map a generational rupture between the younger generation of feminist and anti-racist scholars and activists' engagement with intersectionality and the previous generation, the latter exemplified in the work of authors such as Philomena Essed, Gloria Becker, as well as the publication of Kaleidoscopic Disease in 2001. We argue that the epistemological formations of intersectionality as advanced by Black and women of color feminist scholars in the Netherlands were always already embedded in local grassroots struggles, activism, and coalitional building across Turkish, Moroccan, Surinamese, Caribbean, and other migrant women's groups, but also labor union groups, religious and sexual minority collectives in the 80s and the 90s. These coalitions also nourished intersectional practices as consciousness raising around minoritarian subject positions and experiences, not only on the basis of race, gender, but also class relations. So inspired by these feminist histories in the Dutch context, we're thinking about intersectionality as an insurgent thought practice, one that can resist the concept's recent neoliberal flattening in academic context and its limited engagements with certain ideas of race. This notion of insurgent intersectionality thus foregrounds a transgenerational, multi-ethnic, and international scope and prioritizes radical kinship as the site to enact collective care and collective struggle against different forms of oppression. So one thing that I would love to hear more about in the Q&A maybe later is the role of praxis. What are the practices that you associate with intersectionality? How do you feel it should be put to use as an analytic in order to achieve what you call the expansive intellectual, political, and ethical reach? I want to invite you here in particular to reflect on the political reach of intersectionality in grassroots and social movement organizing that I feel, and I'm maybe intrigued to know why was that the case, was somewhat missing or maybe tangential to the arguments that you propose in the book. Specifically, and this takes me to the last point. I mentioned this here as a bridge to my third point, namely what your epistemological critique of intersectionality means for intersectionality as a political praxis. I want to invoke a recent example of intersectional thought practice that is central to my work, namely the struggle against settler colonialism in the context of Palestine. Gender studies departments and feminist collectives across Europe and North America, including our own, have issued solidarity statements in support of the Palestinian struggle. At the heart of many of these statements is an assertion that academics and programs cannot claim to be intersectional or to do intersectionality and yet look away from Palestine. For example, the US-based campaign, Palestine is a Feminist Issue, centralizes intersectionality as the lens that shows us how Palestine is a feminist issue, so much so that a commitment to intersectional feminism requires a response to the ongoing dispossession of Palestinian land and people. I find this anchoring of coalitional politics and practices of solidarity in the framework of intersectionality very inspiring myself. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how you see intersectionality as a political praxis that extends to feminist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial struggles. And I will end here, and I will say thank you again for your talk, and we'll leave the floor for the Q&A now. So maybe these are not necessarily questions, maybe openings, questions. Please feel free to respond, or maybe respond to them later after the Q&A.
Sure. Thank you so much for those. They're so generative. I'll try to make my comments just short because I know we have folks who want to ask questions. I wanted to say something about Afropessimism, which is such a complicated theoretical and political move, especially in the context of the US Academy, especially in the context of Black Studies, and something that I've been thinking about a lot as someone who was trained in Black Studies and is no longer in a Black Studies department. So I love this question you ask about what it would mean to write a love letter to Afropessimism, who would write it, and what form would it take. Over the last few months, I've written an article, which is coming out in Feminist Theory, that actually tries to think about Afropessimism alongside Catherine McKinnon's dominance feminist work, and tries to think of them both as theories that aspire to offer us an account of the origin of the world, and write this kind of totalizing theory, and then also mobilize similar rhetorical styles, right? And I think there's much to be said about the aesthetics of both projects and how they operate. But there's also a kind of airtightness to both articulations of the universe, right? I mean, to read Catherine McKinnon in my own experience is to be completely seduced by her, even as I might find myself chipping away at her logic, right? There's something very seductive about the vision of the world that she offers. And I think Afropessimism and its refusal of offering any kind of outside to the logics that it offers, right? Where anti-Blackness is the totalizing force, and what we live in is the afterlife of slavery, right? And where Blackness is distinct, particular, cannot be analogized to anything, right? Like there's no outside of that universe. And so there's something really, I think, in some ways alluring about the totality of what it maps. As we think about the relation of Afropessimism to intersectionality, there's just two things I wanted to flag. One is Afropessimism's disavowal of the juridical puts it in a complicated relationship to someone like Crenshaw, right? And this is something that I write about in the book, right? My desire to constantly remember and constantly insist upon the juridical underpinnings of intersectionality is a desire to push US Black Studies in particular to think with the juridical rather than rejecting it as a kind of always already anti-Black political embarrassment, right? And I think the other piece about Afropessimism that's worth us thinking about, and I've written about this elsewhere, is that it has a complicated relationship to gender. It has a complicated relationship to feminist theory. And in my own thinking, right, I think it does this kind of gesturing to Black feminism by naming a very select and particular group of Black feminists as the folks who get cited again and again. So Afropessimism, in my own reading of it, doesn't know what to do with someone like Kimberly Crenshaw or Kobahi or Patricia Williams, right? Even though it knows very much what to do with someone like Hortense Spillers, until she says that she's not an Afropessimist, which upset everybody deeply, right? Or it knows very much what to do with Catherine McKittrick or Christina Sharp or Sylvia Winter. These are the scholars who the feminist scholars who get cited again and again by Afropessimists. And despite the fact that there's a body of Afropessimist work that really wants to sort of take feminism to task by saying that feminism is committed to the idea of a kind of universal gender. Like, one of the things I often find myself asking is what feminists are being cited, right? Like, what feminist literature are they talking about when, for example, Patrice Douglas, my colleague at Duke, will say that gender is an anti-Black construct necessarily. And I'm like, well, which feminists are you thinking with as you describe gender that way? So the second thing about the travel of the intersectionality wars, I think there's much more to be said around the kind of complex desires around institutionalization that have marked Black feminism's travels. The history of Black feminist thought in the US is very much a history of entanglement with the university and a set of intense desires for excuse me, recognition, visibility, and institutionalization, alongside an intense desire to disavow the power that Black feminists have accrued and to insist that we in fact have no power when we do. So and I think there's a really complex set of attachments and desires that have to be mapped there that beg for more conversation. But I think what you sort of put your finger on was this desire for institutional recognition, which is also a desire for institutional resources and field formation, to me requires uncoupling identity and our objects of study. To me, that's what field formation is about, right? And that becomes where I think the institutionalization of Black feminism has become this kind of complicated and really affectively saturated process for Black feminists in the US. And this is not, I should say, anything new. Like the Andrew Steele article that I cite in the talk, which she writes in, I think it's 94, is her really grappling with her ambivalence around seeing Black feminism become a field, right? She argues, wait, there's all these people who labored to make this a field, and now essentially she says, like, white men with PhDs in English who haven't been trained in our field are now writing and publishing articles in the best journals in our field. What does it mean when it becomes, she argues, like an anybody can play pickup game, right? And so we might think about what it means that Black feminism has had this longstanding institutional desire to be desired, and also tremendous feelings of defensiveness when we find other folks kind of in our space. You had asked about questions around praxis, and I will just gesture to, I mean, I think there's a slew of folks who I think with teach and cite who I think offer us interesting openings to how we might think about praxis. I mean, I find myself thinking about June Jordan's canonical report from the Bahamas, where she invites us to think about the need between us as opposed to this idea of the common enemy. I think of Kathy Cohen's canonical work on queerness as coalitional politics. I think of a growing body of scholarship on friendship, and I think about, even as I critique it, this kind of Black feminist idea of intramural care as a way of forging sort of systems and networks of solidarity that elude the surveillance of the state. All of these as kind of forms of praxis that think about how power makes different bodies vulnerable in different ways, right? On the question of Palestine, I mean, it's so interesting to think through the context of the Solidarity Statement in the context of the US Academy, where there's so many complicated politics around Palestine, right? And Jasbir Puar is writing for our same volume, what I think will be a really exciting piece about this notion of intersectionality as anti-Semitic. So I think there's a lot of complicated politics in the US in particular around the question of Palestine and how settler colonialism in the Israeli context gets taken up. I think, though, it was an interesting moment with the statement that you gestured to. I mean, the NWSA, the National Women's Studies Association, also issues a statement. The NWSA is an organization that has been transformed by Black feminists over the last 5 to 10 years. It's an organization I've been involved in for a very long time, that I write about, that has had a long history of being interested in anti-racism, but it has been remade by the labor, intellectual and political labor of Black women and Black feminists, and has become, I think, much more invested in being visible and politically outspoken about issues that it just simply had not been willing to take up before. So there's this interesting kind of shift happening in the US Academy and the US Left Academy that's been fascinating to watch, right? Where for a long time, I think NWSA would have been like, I'm not talking about this, it's taboo, right? And suddenly that was not the case. So one of the questions, one of the things I often do with my students is try to think genealogically. And as someone who's trained in Black studies, I think we inhabit this moment where Black studies has become increasingly interested in conversation with Latinx studies, Asian Am studies, Indigenous studies, and is starting to think and take more seriously questions of coloniality, settler colonialism, and decoloniality. Those are not terms and analytics that in the context of US Black studies have been at the center of the political and intellectual work that we've done. So I think it's really interesting to see how our field begins to think in these terms, right? And what that will mean. So I think of someone like Tiffany Lathobo-King, whose work I think in Black Shoals has sort of inspired the field to think anew about questions of coloniality, decoloniality, and the like. So I'm curious to see how the analytics transform our practice. As I mentioned in my book, I'm not a scholar of transnational feminism, but came to it by virtue of writing this project. And so I'm very interested in how certain terms like the decolonial in the context of the US Academy have how some of the anxieties I track around intersectionality also cohere around terms like the decolonial. I have colleague friends who work around kind of decoloniality and will describe to me how elastic that term has become, how it now describes any form of scholarship that's radical. And so what it means, like I have one colleague who will say, like, what does it mean when folks are doing decolonial work and, for example, not thinking about questions of land and territory? Like how do we think about the elasticity of this term? So I think there are interesting ways of tracking the debates that I'm thinking about around intersectionality and the debates that are happening around a term like the decolonial. This just gets at the tip of the iceberg with your comments, but thank you so much. They're so generative, and I look forward to questions from the audience.
Thank you both. For this, we have, there they are. 2 questions in the Q&A. I realized there is a way that I can unmute our viewers. So Eliza and Sarah, if you want to ask your question personally by way of voice and not video, just raise your hand and I think I can unmute you. If not, let's have a look. So Eliza Steinbock asks a question. Thank you so much for this deeply materialist reading of intersectionality in and generated through visual cultures. I wanted to ask you to expand on the notion of the irresistible visuality of intersectionality. I don't know, Jennifer, if you can read a little further, or if you would like me to read the entire question for everybody in the audience as well.
Sure, I'm just imagine a ... I'm just going to the end of the question, which is, do you think these metaphors are so irresistible because they promise to explain once and for all how to picture oppression because of their abstraction? This seems to have a different kind of lore than that of the meme, tote bag, and sign. So thank you, Eliza, for your question. I will try to do justice to it. You know, one of the things that started this project was thinking about 3 ways that intersectionality has been kind of imagined or envisioned. So one is this now widely circulating idea of the traffic jam.
It looks like Jennifer's frozen. Layel for you too? Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we can get her back. Let's see if through the behind the scenes can get Jennifer back or logged in again. What I can do here, let's see. I can call her, let's see. Let me resend the invitation to her. And I will copy and paste or maybe read. Layal, would you mind reading the other questions so that are, I think we can only, we can see them, but if you could read, can you see the Q&A?
Yes, I can.
And these are only for the panelists, but maybe just read the other two questions. There's one by Sarah and one by Diana.
But Jennifer's not here.
I know, but I guess maybe just to kind of start, you know, sort of to kind of let everybody know what the questions are. And oh, there
she is.
Oh, you're back. Okay, good.
Hi. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened.
No worries. We're glad you're back. We were just thinking what to do in the meantime while getting you back, but we're glad you're here. Do you remember where you were when you got cut off? Might be happening again.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I can read the questions out loud. I just think we're going to have to read them again when she's back online. So maybe we could just have maybe a minute of a break or something.
Let me see if I can still, oh, gone. Yeah, I'll ask her. Oh, there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, of course.
I am so sorry. I got this very strange message that I needed to update my Zoom in the middle of talking to you.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I'm so sorry, everybody. And we were in the middle of a question about visuality. So I've actually switched to my phone, so I cannot see the Q&A anymore. So I'm going to just work on memory from that last one. And again, my apologies. So we had this question about visuality, right? So I was saying that there are these kind of three ways that intersectionality has been visualized. And one of the reasons that I kind of came to this project about the visual was trying to think through how and why this idea of crossroads has had a duration and durability that say something like matrix of domination, which is also this kind of deeply visual metaphor, hasn't had. To the first question about what do I mean by the irresistibly visual, it's a good question. I mean, I think I was trying to think through, some of that term came from my experiences in the classroom, where when I wanted to talk to my students about what intersectionality means and does, we would always start with them drawing these roads on a board, right? Like that was our common grammar around intersectionality. We were always going, and as we talked through the term more, my students would add more roads and rotaries and crosswalk. There was no way for us to talk about the term without turning to gesture, right, in a certain kind of a way. And I was very curious about that. And it made me want to go back to Crenshaw's work and think through, okay, what is the visual doing for her? Like, why as she endeavors to explain intersectionality, does this visual register become so important, particularly as a legal scholar, speaking in a juridical language where, like, if I speak very bluntly as someone who is trained in law, speaking in the language of the visual is not something that's inherent to legal thinking or logic. So that's sort of part of what I wanted to think through with the question of the visual. I hope I'm like I said, I don't have access to the questions on my phone, so I hope that gets at some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me read the next question to you by Sarah Tote, if I pronounce your name correctly. Sarah, thank you for this question. Sarah writes, have you seen a shift in the use of intersectionality in visual culture, memes, or non-visual popular discourse following the debates around critical race theory in the US public education system? Do you anticipate that the backlash against critical race theory in US schools, which is also current policy in politics, right, might lead to a wider mainstream backlash against intersectionality as a term, similar to the relatively recent denouncement of identity politics? And would you expect this to have any impact on the use of intersectionality in Black feminist theory and praxis, or on the commodification of the term? Yeah,
it's such a great question, and I mean, it's something that's ongoing and unfolding here. And there's so much to say about it. I mean, I think one of the things that's so interesting about the circulation of the term critical race theory and the critiques of it is that, I mean, the critiques of critical race theory are unfolding with no understanding of what critical race theory is or means, right? And so the fact that it's a term with a particular history and attachment to the legal academy that has a particular critique of the ways in which anti-discrimination law and other forms of law that are supposed to redress forms of violence against the most marginalized actually work to entrench those forms of violence. All of that has sort of fallen out. Even the fact that someone like Crenshaw is a critical race theorist who was trained by Derek Bell, who is a critical race theorist, have fallen out of the conversation, right? So there is no understanding of what critical race theory is in US popular conversation about the term. What I do think is interesting is that the kind of backlash or right critique of intersectionality, which has circulated for a while. I opened my book, for example, with Andrew Sullivan's notion of intersectionality, as he sort of talks about it as like a group think, this kind of polite language that undergraduates are indoctrinated into in the context of the university. It will be interesting. I think that's exactly how critical race theory is being talked about now, right? So one of the critiques of intersectionality that often circulates is this notion that it overdetermines how we speak about identity, about race, about racism, about the persistence of forms of violence. And that I think that I don't have my copy of my book with me, but Andrew Sullivan says something like it becomes sort of this hegemonic way in which we have to talk about identity, politics, and the like. And there is this sense on the right, I think, that ideas like intersectionality and perhaps like critical race theory have come to be hegemonic and ubiquitous and overdetermine how undergraduates in particular are trained to think about race and racism. I will say as an aside, I mean, I think part of the anxiety in the US about critical race theory, about intersectionality, is an anxiety about the university and what the university does, right? And I think this really heated up sort of post-2016, but this cultural sense emerging from the very powerful right in the US that the university is essentially like run by Black feminists, which is of course a fiction, but that it's run by Black feminists who are indoctrinating students with these kind of Marxist, Black lesbian, radical ideas, and sort of taking innocent, vulnerable, unformed high school students and transforming them into like, you know, insurgent radical warriors, has become this way that college has been thought about and represented in sort of mainstream media in the US. And so I think how intersectionality is getting represented is related to how critical race theory has been represented on the right.
Yeah, thank you. Would you be okay with taking a few more minutes?
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, thank you. For those of you who have to leave at 5, of course, feel welcome to do so. We'll take a few more minutes. We have 2 more questions in the Q&A, or actually 3 by now. Let's see, there's 2 longer ones and 1 very brief one. There's one from Diana, who writes, Diana Helmich, who writes, with intersectionality as such a present visual in the public sphere, is there not a chance of flattening the concept of intersectionality? Diana mentions, yeah, Instagram feminist activism that you also showed some examples of. Intersectional veganism, it floats around Instagram, things like this. In what way could this usage of intersectionality influence the potentialities and futures we can imagine for or with intersectionality as an intellectual project, as well as a political and analytical tool?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Diana. I mean, I suppose there's a few sort of thoughts. First of all, I hadn't heard of intersectional veganism, so thank you for that. Yeah. Second, you know, I think there's this really interesting, for me, ongoing question about what flattening means, right? Like, I think there's this way in which I personally have become more interested in the public life of Black feminist work and Black feminist terminology, and more attuned to how, I mean, first of all, Black feminism has always been a public-facing tradition, and Black feminist thinkers have always been public intellectuals. But at least in the US, there's new markets and new desires for public-facing Black feminist work. And so, well, I think there's this risk of flattening intersectionality, which I think presumes that it has a singular meaning, right? I think we're also in this moment where there's a proliferation of intersectionalities, right? And to me, I think part of the anxiety that I try to diagnose in the book and think through is this notion, I think that, I think intersectionality is one tool that we have for thinking about how power operates, and one tool that we have for imagining a different kind of future. I think the anxiety about the term being flattened for me emerges when we forget that it's one of many tools that we have, right? When we think it's our only tool for imagining a different kind of future, there's certain kinds of anxieties we feel about seeing the term used or mobilized or circulated in ways that feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. But when it's one tool of many, I'm like, oh, okay, it's interesting for me to see how this term moves geographically, institutionally, how it moves digitally, right? Like I try to remain curious about it. As I say in my book, I also have moments of feeling defensive, curious, uncertain about seeing intersectionality touch objects that feel to me like, oh, okay, I didn't know that object was right for intersectional analysis. I'm curious about that. But I as I say in my book, I try to hold a kind of critical openness about intersectionality's movements, and also remind myself and remind my students that Black feminism has offered us many ways of thinking through power, solidarity, collectivity, and friendship that we can mobilize.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That is a beautiful answer, a hopeful one too, I think. So let's see, we have two more, and the last one is very short, so I'll add that one on as well for you to answer. Sure. The first one is from Miriam Urach. Question regarding the point about travel, right? Is it safe to say that Black feminism and intersectionality are mainly US products? We've seen a lot of examples of other kinds of products in your talk as well. And so will be in tension with other Black thinking and praxis, thinking about other areas, other continents. Was there not also a history of tense but very healthy debate between US and Caribbean Black intellectuals in the 50s and 60s? And then a question from Shruti Bala. What do you think of terms like BIPOC and BIPOC, especially from your visual iconographical approach? So let's leave it with those two questions and give you the time to those.
Thank you for both of those. To the first about intersectionality as a kind of US product, I think the kind of thinking that intersectionality represents is not inherent or intrinsic to the US context. I think that intersectionality's dramatic, rapid travels and circulations are very much related to the fact that it's associated with the US Academy. And so I think I used to be on the board of Feminist Theory, which is a UK-based feminist scholarly journal. And one of the things that my colleagues were always saying to me was, folks in the States never read or cite our work, and we have to read and cite your work. And for me, it was a really productive and generative way of thinking about the ways in which a term like intersectionalities, its circulations, its global circulations, right, have been made possible at least in part by the fact that it has emerged, this particular iteration of it has emerged from the US Academy. And I will say, I will point to a very generative discussion in the journal EPW that was Navita Menon and 3 other Indian feminists taking up the question of intersectionality's meaning and utility in the context of Indian feminisms. And this is a question that I've started to think through around intersectionality circulation, around Dalit feminist activism. So I think it's a question that's been taken up, and it's been taken up in a lot of national context. On new terminology, I mean, I think there's something so interesting about this kind of 2020 moment, the long 2020 that we're in, where there's this sense, I always describe it to my colleagues as this sense that language can save us, right? And so I think of the proliferation of terminology, including in the context of the US, when the Associated Press announced that we no longer write Black with a lowercase b, but a capital B, and scholarly journals, which had long refused that, now will capitalize the B in Black. I think about getting emails from the president of my university where he uses BIPOC as a term to describe students and constituencies. And I've remained very curious about that, not as a suspicion around the terms themselves, but around a sense that the term, that these kind of this linguistical choreography is imagined as in and of itself political work, or as constitutive of the political act, right? And that's the thing that I'm curious about. So like, for example, what does the move from the small b in Black to the big B in Black in the New York Times actually do or perform as political work in the world? And I think it's fascinating that so many of these kind of
grammatical changes happened this past year, right? At least in the context of the US, a year that's been described as the time of racial reckoning, whatever that means. I think there is this way that language is imagined to get us out of the problem of the larger reckoning that needs to happen. So hopefully those sort of get at some of the broader themes underpinning both of those questions.
Thank you so much. We're 7 minutes over. We have one raised hand.
Yeah, so let's do it. Absolutely.
Okay. So one raised hand. What I can see, the name here is Lan. So I will allow you to talk and try to talk and see what happens. Okay. Can you speak and ask your question? Talking is permitted? No. No. Okay, so let's see if you want to put your question in the chat instead, or in the Q&A. I seem to have raised my own hand in the process. Okay. Okay. All right, so this I think is the time to conclude and say thank you so much, Jennifer, for staying on a little longer, for sharing with us your new work and your new thinking on the visuality of intersectionality and what that means to critique it and to keep using it from that point of view, which is a very present contemporary doorway into what we can do with the concept, with the idea, with the theory. Let me see if I can. There's Layal. Layal, thank you for your commentary. Thank you both for your discussion, response, and debate. I wish you both a restful summer. And Jennifer, again, it was a pleasure to reconnect with you. And thank you for your time, sharing your time and your insights with our community, with our students, with our colleagues.
Thank you.
It's been a great joy to have you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.